Are you there, participants? Hello. Dear participants, have you joined?
सर गुड आफ्टरनून.
Good afternoon. कैसा है? ठीक है सर?
हाँ हाँ ठीक है सर. नाउ वी आर ऑलमोस्ट रेडी टू गो फॉर द कन्वोकेशन.
Okay. Oh, convocation is 2:30. Yeah. Oh, अच्छा है. Oh, चलिए चलिए अच्छा है. आज तो
only to introduce you, no, I am just waiting after
नहीं नहीं
introduce you, hand over the session to you, then I will leave
सर, आप
for the
जाइए सर, मैं करा
processing,
दूंगा, कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है. निश्चिंत होके जाइए. 1:30 बज रहा है, 2:30 बजे है. आप जाइए सर, मैं करा दूंगा. नो प्रॉब्लम.
हाँ
नो नीड इंट्रोडक्शन. जाइए सर,
हाँ just
मैं करा दूंगा.
sir, now I yeah. So dear participant, we are very happy. Today we have Biswajit Mohapatra sir from NEHU. Sir, I sorry sir, actually the things is in my office and today my office they closed. The security people, my office is in main road, so they are not allowing to enter in office. They seized all the things. So with the sir, he belong to the NEHU, very good researchers and thorough knowledgeable person, published many papers. Okay, so with this sir, small introduction, just I am handing over the session to you, and within 1 or 2 minutes, sir, I have to leave.
Sure, no problem. Thank you very much. कर लेंगे सर.
Yeah.
बिल्कुल. Thank you. All the best, sir.
Thank you, sir.
करेंगे
Now
सर.
you can start, sir.
Yes. Participants 22 है, only 22. Yeah, dear participants,
There
I
is
think
30.
30,
There is
sir.
30, sir. Actually, before your class, there is a lunch break. Within 1 or 2 minutes, they are
Yeah,
joining.
I'll wait, sir. I'm waiting. So 1:30 only. 5 minutes wait कर लेंगे. Right, sir? Thank you, sir. Bye.
Okay.
Bus, lecture to start. Lecture to start 1:30. 1:30 Mizoram HRDC. Yeah. That's why I came at 1, no? Okay. Okay, thank you. Please. Okay, thank you. You are the boss. I will just be back in a minute, right? We will wait for 5 minutes. Dear friends, we will wait for 5 minutes, then we start.
Yeah, Biswajit sir.
Sir.
Actually, the participant are in webinar mode. They will only reply by the chat box
no
message.
Problem. Yes, sir. वो थोड़ा सा 24
so
हुआ है.
Within 24 is there. So within 2-3 minutes you can start.
Sure, sir. कर देंगे. बिल्कुल, sir. No problem, sir. I'm here. Okay. Yeah, friends, we will start. I think all of you are 25 are here. I don't see many people turning back for the lecture. You are there? Hello? Hello?
Sir, they are there, sir. Now you can start, sir.
Yeah,
As
right.
I
Thank
told
you.
you,
आप
they are
ready,
in
sir?
webinar
Thank you. Sure,
mode.
sir. Sure, sir. We'll start.
Bas Nicholas. Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
I think, friends, I'm at the outset. I must thank Dr. Manas Barma for who is taking a lot of pains in organizing the orientation program. And I know the refresher, these such courses do require a lot of responsibility, a lot of time and efforts on the part of the organizer, on the part of the coordinator to get resource persons to speak to the participants. I think, and I'm sure, and I very well know also that he's doing a very good job. We must thank him for his painstaking effort for making this course a reality. I must also thank you in particular, the teachers, young teachers who have also spared their time and opportunity and also other opportunities to be here in this course, which is organized by Mizoram University HRDC. This HRDC is also well known for organizing many courses which they have been holding it regularly, and I have heard also that it has such courses have also received very positive feedback from participants, which draw the participants to every course that they hold. I think with these few words, we must start our lecture. Since the topic of the day is multiculturalism, we need to understand the kind of challenges which were faced by the human society, so to say, before multiculturalism, before multiculturalism became a reality and became a policy option for the so-called post-colonial states to adopt to their as the state policy and also for the welfare of the people. We will also discuss as to how such multiculturalism has become a very much a reality for a very longer period in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Canada, how it has proved to be fruitful and how that has encouraged the other third world countries, the developing countries, to adopt such policies, given the fact that the countries are multicultural in nature. Today, when you talk about, if we just define any state, including India, and state here is a country, we know very well that you know India is described when you write it's a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious country, which tends to point out to the fact that it is multicultural in the sense that people of diverse culture, diverse religion, diverse community background, they tend to be residing in the so-called post-colonial state. I think the post-colonial state is very important simply because because it has become a home to not particularly to any particular community, but it constitutes multiple communities, which is the beauty of the state, which may be posing the problem for governance, but nonetheless, such challenges do enrich the democratic process of governance being followed by the developing countries, the newly independent post-colonial countries, and it has also contributed towards enormous welfare of the people, howsoever limited it may be when we compare the development process of the third world countries vis-a-vis that of the Western countries. Why I'm saying it, but just as a point, not to feel discouraged, even if we have not done as well as we should have had, and as has been done probably by the Western countries, including Canada. But since we are late in the scenario, we need to understand our own limitations. We need to also improve on our own policies so as to continue to follow multicultural policy, which has proved to be a boon for the other countries which are equally multicultural in nature. Today, when we look at any country, I think we almost have more than 200 kind of states. Although states are countries, and although there are the United Nations tends to have 192 plus member states, but nonetheless, we now know that including some territories, almost more than 200 nation states seem to have come into existence, and all of them we can see that they have become multicultural in the process of the so-called process of migration, and also the economic development policies which are being followed by certain countries. and which tend to have given rise to the so-called process of migration. I think, just one sec, why it's not coming? Yeah. Just one, I'll just put on the record. Just one sec, sir. One sec. Just one sec. Yeah, I think when you talk of multiculturalism, I think before we go into a discussion on what is multiculturalism, we need to understand as to what do we have to mean exactly by multiculturalism. I think when you talk of multiculturalism, we need to understand that multiculturalism tend to have arose in the human consciousness as a desired value for the appreciation, acceptance, or promotion of multiple cultures that seem to be existing in the demographic makeup of human societies. In other words, when you talk of multiculturalism, it tends to be known as nothing but mutual recognition of appreciation, acceptance, and also tend to stand up for our own human qualities, for promoting the other cultures which are coexisting amidst us, along with us in the same human societies, and which are very much a fact of life. So multiculturalism tends to have become a desired value simply because that when people of different communities, people of diverse backgrounds, diverse culture backgrounds, people of diverse religion, people of diverse other kind of beliefs, including animistic and other kind of beliefs, they tend to residing. Multiculturalism tends to represent some kind of a positive approach as a positive value to accept, to appreciate, and also to sort of promote the other cultures which belong to other communities and who tend to live amidst us, along with us in the same human societies. So here we find that this multiculturalism has been adopted as a policy within the so-called modern day nation states. I think when you talk about political domain, when you talk of nation states, when you talk of political domain, we find that the multiculturalism as a policy tends to be much more applicable in the context of the politics, which is responsible for the policy making processes and for socio-economic development of any country. And I think in the political domain, multiculturalism has been applied much more virulently, much more strongly, much more consciously than what we can talk about in other kind of in other domains of the society. I think in political domain, the multiculturalism tends to literally stand for adoption of a range of policies which are considered to be very much useful for people belonging to all kind of cultural backgrounds. I think when you talk about adoption of a range of policies, we need to understand that the moment we talk of making a policy in the so-called democratic setup, whenever we think of adopting a policy or making a policy for the benefit of the society, the first thing that ever comes to our mind is the equal respect to all. I think when you talk of equal respect to all, which tends to flow from the concept of multiculturalism, it tends to mean that equal respect to all means equal respect to all the various cultures which tend to be present within our own society. I think in the political domain, multiculturalism has also been known for a policy which stands out very, very vividly for promotion and maintenance of cultural diversity. We all understand that since we are multicultural societies, since people have different kind of diverse cultures, and since every culture is very much close to the heart of the people who tend to practice that culture, every community would like to see that their cultures are promoted, are nourished, and also are not suppressed or are not suppressed by the state, by the country, by the government of the country, as was the case in the so-called colonial days. So here, equal respect means equal respect for all cultures of the people, of those diverse people who tend to belong to those cultures. And also it tends to mean that multiculturalism tends to be well known for the policy of promotion and maintenance of cultural diversity. And it also tends to mean a set of policies in which people of various ethnic and religious groups, despite the fact that they are diverse from the so-called majority, can grow and develop and also can attain their kind of goals which they have set for themselves as living human beings. I think when you talk about the promotion and protection, promotion maintenance of cultural diversity, that means that every community, people belonging to every community must have the opportunity to develop themselves to the extent that they can, since they are living organism, and they are belonging to any kind of a different, any kind of a different religion or ethnicity should not come in the way of the development of human beings, and they must also be able to have a sense of belongingness to the country, to the nation that they tend to come from, and they will also have to, they will be able to live a life which is free from any kind of alienation. So here we can understand that multiculturalism tends to be very, very positive as a value, simply because it tends to ensure, as we say, if we go back to Indian constitution, it tends to ensure equal opportunity for all, irrespective of the background, to develop, to attain, and also to achieve their goals, what they may have set for themselves, and to live as equal human beings in an equal manner, irrespective of their diversity, and to be treated as a human being, as an equal partner in the same society in which they seem to be resident of. So here we find, so multiculturalism in the political domain tends to be aimed at helping the human beings to getting rid of the so-called sense of alienation, and tends to contribute towards a sense of belongingness of the people from diverse backgrounds to the same nation, to the same country that they tend to be residing of, and this tends to make human beings to live a life which is free from alienation, and live life which is filled up with what is called the positive value of freedom. I think, if at all and also the other thing is that this multiculturalism as a policy also in the political domain tends to also ensure that people, instead of being subjected to any kind of a governmental control, they would be able to achieve their goals free from any kind of authorities or free from any kind of governmental control. So it is very much a kind of a policy which is anti-authoritarian in character, and we can also say it is very much democratic in character, simply because it ensures everyone's growth, everyone's development, everyone's lifestyle, everyone's culture to be nourished, to be preserved, to be maintained, and to be protected from any kind of an assault or any kind of an attack, be it from the majority community, or be it from any other community which may be aiming itself to dominate over other cultures. So it tends to be very, very positive in nature. I think, and if we rather go, if we ever wonder as to why multiculturalism as a policy, although it is new to human world, has to be pursued as an act of governance, or as an instrument of governance in the so-called democratic societies in today's world. We have to understand that the pursuance of such policies tend to aim at preservation of what we call it multiculturalism, or multicultural background, or multicultural historical background of the people who tend to be living in the same society. And such policies, as and when they are pursued in our own world, it has proved to be very, very useful, since it has helped in the maintenance of cultural diversity and cultural mosaic by carefully avoiding any kind of a projection of preserving any specific ethnic, religious, or cultural community as was present in the colonial era. I think when you talk of colonialism, we need to understand that in the colonial world, it was almost a policy of dominance, and the colonialists were very much familiar, very much well known to have pursued the policy of divide and rule. But here, multiculturalism tends to have been pursued as a policy document in order to ensure that all the cultures of people which tend to be present in human society are preserved, and should be also considered useful in the maintenance of the cultural mosaic and it also tends to help in not letting any particular community, any particular, be it ethnic, be it religious, or be it any kind of a cultural community, to dominate, to be central to the country's mode of governance, as was the practice in the colonial policies. And now we can see multiculturalism is much more positive, simply because it tends to go beyond the so-called policies that were followed by the democratic countries in the post-independence era, in the name of assimilation, or also in the name of social integration. So I think, the multiculturalism tends to be rather much more broader than social integration, much more broader than what we know as policy assimilation. And it is found that while policy assimilation and social integration could be authoritarian in character, as examples of certain countries which had not adopted multicultural policies tend to so, and here multiculturalism tends to be rather very useful, since it tends to not let any, and it doesn't recognize the preeminence, the domination of any particular religious or cultural, or we can say any particular ethnic community within any particular society. So that way we find that the multiculturalism tends, as a post-colonial policy, tends to have been very popular as an instrument of democratic governance, simply because it tends to be representing a broader approach in preserving the so-called diverse cultures, rather than allow any particular culture to dominate, as was the case in history. So I think when you, since we are talking of post-colonial days, since we are talking of the post-independent period of many developing countries, I think we need to understand that the multiculturalism as a policy option, as a policy document, tends to have become very popular, more particularly in the democratic countries, or if you can say in the democratic societies, simply because that multicultural policies tend to be rightly focusing upon interaction and communication between different cultures. I think, when you talk of the colonial period and the post-colonial period, in case of any of the developing country, we can see that while the colonial period, the colonial administration was hell-bent upon keeping people in isolation. The colonialists didn't allow any community to come in contact with many other communities, and they were pursuing the policy of, hence they were pursuing the policy of divide and rule. But here, multiculturalism or multicultural policies tend to be in the nature of communication, because it tends to facilitate, it tends to enable the right kind of interaction and communication between different cultures which are present within the particular human society. And here we find that why, and the question remains as to why do cultures have to communicate? Why should they have a dialogue? I think we all know in the human society, dialogue tends to bring diverse people together, tends to enable people to understand the commonality, the common approach that is considered important in a human society for everyone's survival. Survival here is for everyone's life, which tends to befit human dignity. And here, multicultural policy also tends to emphasize on the interaction of cultures, simply because it is believed that only through interaction of cultures, only through following a policy of anti-isolation, people can be provided with opportunities. I think, when we all know in today's days of information technology and rapid communication, we know how by coming in contact with various kinds of people and phenomena which are mediated through the internet, we are able to discover many more opportunities for our own life, for our own, not only for survival but also for our economic prosperity, compared with the fact that we used to know very little about the opportunities which may be available in our own vicinity for our own self growth. So here we find that multicultural tends to believe that only through communication of cultures, only through interaction of cultures, people can be provided with better opportunities, and it can also facilitate a lot of opportunities for appreciation of cultural differences that may be existing across the cultures. I think, it tends to act like a breeze, where people, instead of developing different ideas which may be often untrue, which may be unsubstantiated about the difference in their culture, they tend to, by only through interactions, they tend to discover as to what is so good, positive about the other cultures, and how they need to be appreciated, and how the culture, although it tends to belong to different socio-economic and ethnic religious background, the culturally all the main principles tend to be almost similar, and it tends to bring people together towards the achievement of one particular common aim, that is the what is called human prosperity. We are not talking human survival, because human being to survival, what is necessary is, if there is human prosperity, then probably the societies will also become prosperous, and they will also go in for better kind of governance. Anyway, so here we find that the multiculturalism tends to believe that when people tend to interact and tend to communicate with each other, they would be able to preserve their own multiculturalism on a broader level. That people themselves would become the, when they interact, they themselves would become the preservers of the multiculturalism which is present in their own society, and they don't have to depend on any other agency, any third agency to come and help them to preserve the so-called multiculturalism which is very much present within their own societies. I think, when you talk about the preservation of multiculturalism, we need to understand that there have been many policies which have been enacted in the post-colonial period of various developing countries, including in some advanced Western countries, and we find that these policies which have been enacted in the name of multiculturalism tend to be tend to be rather aimed at maintenance of diversity and also cultural uniqueness. I think the multicultural policies, any policy which tends to be reflective of multiculturalism, tend to be aimed at not only preserve maintenance of diversity, but it also tends to aim at preservation of the cultural uniqueness, which is very, very unique to the various different diverse socio-economic, religious, and various other social communities of people who tend to be living in the same society. I think, and then these multiple policies were enacted, as we said, that it was these policies tend to have been enacted by the various countries with the single most important aim is that to end the isolations, the isolated feeling which was existing across the communities within the same human society. So I think because isolation, cultural isolation doesn't help in the preservation and unique local culture of a nation or area, it was believed that multicultural policies should be pursued as a very, very desirable policy option for the developing countries. And we find that, say, it was also believed that multiculturalism also will contribute to what is the fact of the world is that of global cultural diversity. So if people are able to preserve the different kind of cultures which are present within their own societies, it is believed that people also in the process would be able to contribute to global cultural diversity, which tends to be again the fact of life. So here we find when you talk of multiculturalism, we now know the multicultural is nothing but it is a policy framework. It is a philosophy, right? It is a value, all right, but it is not merely that. It also tends to have become a kind of a policy framework, which has been used by the various countries which have followed multiculturalism as a better policy to successfully reach out to both the native-born population, both native-born people, native-born indigenous population, and as well as non-indigenous population, the newer contacts, which they are present within their own society, and this policy has been used to reach out to both indigenous population, non-indigenous population, and newer contacts for building up a lasting relationship with different ethnic and religious communities that exist in the fringe of the societies. I think the multiculturalism as a policy tend to have been used to not only to bring together both the native born and also the non-native born, or as you call it, non-indigenous population together, since it believes in dialogue. It tends to have also brought together new contacts amongst people, and in the process, it has tended to have aimed at building up a kind of a lasting relationship amongst the different ethnic and religious communities, which tend to, including the communities which existed in the fringe of the societies because of the isolation that they were subjected to in the days of colonialism. So we can see that multiculturalism tends to be much more comprehensive in nature than the policies of so-called national integration or social integration or any kind of a policy of assimilation. So I think if we go a little further, I think the multiculturalism as a philosophy tends to aim at encouraging the communities, the diverse communities, the different ethnic, religious communities which tend to be present in the society to participate fully in the processes of society. So I think when you talk of so multiculturalism tends to be rather also participative in nature. It tends to enhance the participation of people in the various processes, or you can say in the diverse processes which tend to go on continuously in building up the society, the human society, as we can see from day to day. So here we find that it tends to encourage the people to participate in the society which relate to economic, social, and cultural aspects too. So here we find when people tend to participate in the economic, in the social, and also in the cultural processes, we find that people tend to become people tend to develop, people tend to become one, people tend to develop a sense of feeling of oneness, and they also tend to rather not emphasize on their own differences vis-a-vis the other cultures. Rather, they tend to become one, and as they become familiar with such multicultural policies and participate in the processes, they tend to they tend to become very familiar with the process, and then they tend to also contribute towards what we say, towards the participation of various communities in the economic, cultural, social, and other integration processes, which are the so-called processes of the modern day governance. I think if we have to look into a particular book which is titled Political Ideologies, Andrew Haywood, who is a famous author, he tends to talk of two forms of multiculturalism. I think, when you, and we know that even since there's not only diversity of culture, there is also diversity of geography, there is also diversity of socio-economic background, and it also tends to lead to diverse kind of policies which may be drawn, or which may have a single most important objective, or single most common objective. In this case, it could be multicultural. So Andre Haywood, in his book Political Ideologies, tend to talk of two kinds of multiculturalism which have been followed by the so-called post-colonial countries in the post-colonial world. I think he tends to, according to him, multiculturalism is two types, which he calls, I quote, descriptive, and he says normative multiculturalism. So here we find that when he talks of descriptive multiculturalism, it tends to mean multiculturalism is used to refer to cultural diversity. He says when we refer to descriptive multiculturalism, he tends to believe that in their context, multiculturalism tend to mostly refer to the cultural diversity which is present in any human society. And normatively, when you talk about the value, normatively, multiculturalism tend to have implied a positive endorsement of the diversity, differences, or divergences of thought, of belief, of action, and other kind of, and faith in any kind of a human society. So here you find normatively multiculturalism tends to represent a kind of a celebration of the diversities, celebration of positive endorsement of the diversity present in the society, like a communal diversity. And here we find that multiculturalism tend to be typically based on the right of different groups to respect and recognition, or on the alleged benefits to the larger society of moral and cultural diversity. In other words, it is said that moralism, that normatively multiculturalism can be said to be based on the right of different groups to here is entitlement to respect and recognition, and also to the alleged benefits which can be there to the larger community, to the larger society, in terms of moral and cultural diversity. I think here it is very clear that as a value, multiculturalism tends to be much more superior to any kind of political value that we may have come to know till now, and it tends to also it tends to amount to celebration of the diversity rather than any kind of a concern of the diversity which may be present in the society. And we all know that any kind of a narrow, fearful concern of the differences in any situation, including the society, tends to be responsible for the rising level of violence, including political violence, that we see within our own society rather than contributing to any positive benefit. But here we can find that it tends to be positive in the sense that it tends to and it tends to insist on the right or to respect and recognition on the part of each community, and it also tends to be based on the kind of benefits which the larger society can gain, can have, or can achieve, particularly in the moral and also in the cultural domain. So here we find that when you look into another author, Susan Wesendorf tend to call multiculturalism the human right revolution. The multiculturalism which tend to have come up as a particular policy tends to Susan Wesendorf tends to say that the human right revolution tend to have contributed towards increased support for what we know as the modern day multiculturalism. Susan Wesendorf is of the view that because of the human right revolution which took place in the aftermath of French Revolution, which talk of life, liberty, and equality, and then thereafter, as the because the fight of the so-called erstwhile colonial countries against the colonial master, it tends to symbolize, it tends to have brought forth the human rights revolution in the various countries, and Susan Wesendorf tends to say that because of the human rights revolution which took place in various parts of the world, more particularly in certain very selected colonial centers, she says that this human rights revolution tend to have contributed to increased support for the so-called modern day multiculturalism that we are able to witness in many a society in the so-called present day world. And she says that hence this human rights revolution, since it tends to have exposed the horrors of what we call it anti-Semitism, or we call it institutional racism and ethnic cleansing, which was practiced in the days of Holocaust and ever after, this human rights revolution tend to have contributed towards a kind of a heightened consciousness of multiculturalism in the human society. He says, as we know, as human rights revolution exposed the so-called institutional racism which was being practiced in many a society, and also tend to have laid bare the ethnic cleansing process which was silently being practiced by the majority community against the minority community, even in the European societies. She says that these tend to have, by exposing them, human rights revolution tend to have made it possible that multiculturalism as a state policy to gain more traction, to gain more acceptance in the policy making circles than it would have been otherwise. So here we find that somewhat we find the human rights revolution tend to have provided increased support for the so-called multiculturalism that we tend to be talking about today. The states tend to be practicing today, and the people tend to be benefiting from such background. So I think, in addition to this, we also need to remember that in addition to human rights revolution, there was also the colonial nations fight. The colonized nations of Asia, Africa, and we all know that they continue to lead struggle for their independence for a longer period. I think you all know that India got independence after almost 200 years of colonial rule. So here, and I think in Africa also, there have been longer period of colonial rule which tend to have not only destroyed their economy, tend to destroy their society, and we find that colonized nations in Africa fight for independence tend to have again laid bare the policy in the not only the policies of institutional racism, it is also laid bare the fact that all the policies which have been followed by the colonial masters tend to have had racial underpinning, and that is how we will find the policies were mostly resulting in the divide and rule, which they of course wanted, but which proved damaging for the so-called human society. I think, and the changes in the Western societies, and also the various changes which came about in Western societies as the colonies were being given independence, and also more particularly after the Second World War. And the collapse of the European colonial system tend to have contributed towards the increased popularity of multiculturalism as a policy option for the so-called developing countries and also certain countries from the West. So I think, so here we find if multiculturalism tend to have arose out of this long struggle of the countries of Western Africa, and also for the due to changes in the Western countries because of the grant of independence to colonies and the collapse of the European colonial system, we find multiculturalism has come to remain as a very, very useful strategy in the case of the countries which were looking for the preservation, not only preservation and maintenance of the divergence or differences or diversity that they were having within their own human societies. So here you find the multiculturalism tends to prove itself a useful strategy as a modern day governance. And we find that this multiculturalism tends to have been also useful in combating the widespread idea of racism, which was propagated by the so-called colonial masters. I think today, when you talk about the caste system, when you talk about other kind of divisiveness, various factors of division which are present within our own society, we tend to insist upon it because the fact that the colonial masters not only made us aware of it, they also in their own discourse keep on repeating as to how there are certain very parts of the social system which are perhaps not equal and which are also not modern, in the sense it doesn't conform to the modern day expectations of the so-called modern societies of the West. I think multiculturalism was also adopted by the post-independent states, since they found it useful to combat the widespread ideas of racism which had been propagated by the colonial masters. It was also adopted as a policy to protect the minority communities of all types and to further reverse those state policies which are deprived the minorities from having full access to the opportunities for freedom and equality which was promised by the so-called Western liberalism. In other words, multiculturalism tends to have been pursued as a policy to combat the widespread ideas of building of racism, which was propagated by the colonial masters. It is also used as a policy to protect the minorities from being further exploited by any other community. It also tends to aim at reversing those policies which have deprived the minorities from enjoying the freedom of full access to the opportunities, and also the policy of equality which had been promised by the so-called modern democratic countries. So here we find that how multiculturalism tends to be rather an enabler in helping people belonging to different backgrounds to achieve their goals, to live as human beings, befitting their dignity, and also to be able to work with their head held high in the midst of other communities without being subjected to any feeling of alienation, any sense of deprivation, or any kind of oppression. So here we can find that how the multicultural policies tends to be almost an enabler rather than a kind of a disabler. So here we find that these multicultural policies, these developments which rapidly followed the adoption of democratic form of government in many a country, tend to have set forth the process which has led to multiculturalism being to be adopted as an official policy in several Western nations. In other words, it is believed that not only the developing countries tend to have adopted the multiculturalism as a policy objective, it is also seen that the Western countries tend to have also followed the developing countries in adopting the so-called multicultural policy. And this development came up in the Western countries since the 1970s. So here we find that from 1944, when the Second World War came to end, until 1970s, we can find that it took about quite a lot of years, almost like 25 years, if we agree, 25 to 26 years for the Western countries to adopt a multicultural policy, as opposed to the policy that they were following in their own country, which was not multicultural in nature. I think since the 1990s, we find that Canadian government also adopted multicultural as a policy around the same time. So 1970s tends to be a kind of a very useful milestone in the with on the way on for the simple reason that Canada also, along with many of the Western nations, tend to adopted multicultural policies as one of the policy aspect in their task of or in their domain of democratic governance. I think here we find in the culturally diverse nations, states in Africa and Asia, we find the multiculturalism tend to be used in a very descriptive sense. I think in the so-called culture diverse nation of Asia and Africa, which are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-community in nature, we find that in our nations of Africa and Asia, multiculturalism tend to be followed in a descriptive sense rather than in a normative sense. I think descriptive sense refers to the task of objective of preservation of or maintenance and preservation of cultural diversity. So here we find in the case of the West, we find that the multicultural policy in the case of the Asia, Africa, and Latin American countries, we find multiculturalism is followed in a descriptive sense, and while and which were similar to the multicultural policies which are being followed in the so-called Western world. So when we talk about the descriptive and normative of multiculturalism, we get to know that multiculturalism as in a normative sense is not practiced as virulently, as strongly as multiculturalism is practiced in a descriptive sense of the word. So I think and since we talked about the Canada in 1970, we find that the Canada by adopting the 1970 was not only the first country to adopt post-colonialism, but we also find that Canada is also a country which has been noted with observers for the seriousness, for the sincerity that it showed in adopting such multicultural policy or multicultural ideology by laying strong emphasis on the social importance of immigration. I think we all know that how Canada is still known as the land of immigration, land of the immigrants, and where we find that because of the typical process of immigration, Canada tends to have people from diverse religious, cultural, and other kind of social and ethnic backgrounds, and to be able to cope up with this, what do you call it, the tumor, cope up with this huge inflow of immigrants. Canada showed the sincerity, Canada showed the seriousness. Canada was also quite fast in adopting the multiculturalism as one of its state policy. And we find here multiculturalism, and when you talk of Canada having adopted multiculturalism, we find that the multiculturalism as a policy tend to have been adopted and reflected in the law through the Canadian Multiculturalism Act. And when you talk of Act, we find that the Canadian Parliament tend to have passed a Canadian Multiculturalism Act, in which it was approved and made known to everyone within the country that Canada would be following the multicultural policy, multiculturalism as a policy objective, wherein it would ensure respect and recognition of all people belonging to diverse cultural background, and would also ensure everyone's well-being, irrespective of the fact that their socio-economic, religious, ethnic background may not be same compared with the other. So Canadian society as such has been often depicted as being very progressive, diverse, and multicultural in nature, because Canada tend to have adopted this broad policy, which was probably new to many other countries, along the Western countries. Since it was the first, it has been very quick in adopting such policy, in ensuring that people belonging to diverse communities tend to get respect and the recognition that they are entitled to as human beings is ensured. Canada has shown its own nature of being progressive, its own nature of being diverse, its own nature of also being multicultural whenever we talk of the multicultural post-independent societies. I think when you talk about the Canadian migration, when you talk about the land of immigrants or land of immigration, we find the Canadian society tend to have a large component of population which tend to comprise of immigrants who have come from far distant countries of Asia, Africa, including Middle East, and also South Asia, Southeast Asia, and also East Asia. I think we can see that a sizable population of Canada tends to have come from Asia and Africa, and these immigrants tend to have come from various regions of the country, which tends to be from Asia, from Middle East, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and also from East Asia. Sorry, I took water. And I've been, and we find that like Canada, we also find that India has also adopted a multicultural. India has also adopted multiculturalism as a state policy, and since India is also multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multiple faith in nature, and we find that like Canada, India is a diversically, and India is a ethnically diverse country. India is also linguistically very diverse. India is also India is also, as we find, India is also a diverse country, and ethnically and religiously it is very much diverse, and it also has a long history of unique geography and also diversity of demography. So I think when you look into both India outside India, when you look into inside India, we can find that India seems to be almost diverse in every respect of the term. And we find that since India tend to have a diversity in nature inbuilt into it, we find India not only adopted multiculturalism as a policy option, India has also developed a commonality of culture. When you talk of India today, we find that in the nature of developing multiculturalism, India has developed a commonality of culture. And here we find that this common culture that we often talk about in the context of India tends to be a product of amalgamation of different subcultures which have existed for millions of years. So today, when you look into as to what constitutes Indian culture, it will be very, very difficult to find out as to which is the most important strand of Indian culture, because you find that Indian culture tends to be a mixture, an amalgamation of different subcultures which have been existing in our own society, in our own country for millions of years, and hence we have adopted or we have developed a commonality of culture for our own society. And we find that through multiculturalism, although it is not used in our policy document, it's very interesting. Although we have not adopted an act in India as Canada adopted, but yet, although we have not mentioned multiculturalism as a policy option or as a policy objective in any official document, yet India tend to have followed multiculturalism as a state policy, simply because it tends to emphasize on diversity in all its official dealings, and it also tends to explain the strength of unity in cultural bonds and cultural existence. I think that's how when you talk of unity in diversity, I think we all are familiar. Being Indians, unity in diversity tends to be nothing else than emphasizing diversity as a kind of a diversity as a common denominator of Indian culture, which tends to also reflect the unity in our own unity amongst the diverse cultures, diverse cultural bonds, diverse cultural modes of existence that are present within our own society. And hence, India has also, without mentioning, India has also followed the policy of multiculturalism. I think that is where when we talk about all in one in all, and that is where we tend to understand that that this particular policy tends to be nothing else than emphasizing on commonality of culture and also of commonality of diversity. Even though diversity may be present, but it is no more emphasized as a kind of a divider. Rather, it is emphasized as a unifier for the multi-ethnic population who tend to be part and parcel of what is known as the whole of India. I think when you talk about India and Canada as being the pioneer in following the multiculturalism as a state policy or a or a policy option, we find India and Canada and many other third world countries, and as I said, because of migration, tend to have become pluralistic societies. When we talk of pluralistic, we find that people belonging to more than one ethnic community tend to be found in many third world countries, including in the Western countries and also that of Canada. And I think when you talk about India, we find India tend to have a more diverse indigenous tribal population in Northeast India. Where when you talk of Canada, we find 40% of the Canadian population tend to be either non-French or non-British heritage. I think in India, when you talk of the Northeast having 40% of the India's Northeast tend to have more diverse indigenous tribal population. We all know, since most of you come from Mizoram, or maybe a majority of you must be coming from Mizoram. We know very well that how more than 200 ethnic communities tend to be tribal communities tend to be residing in the whole of Northeast India, which tends to not only represent the diverse character of the region, it also tends to speak of the diverse cultures which have been followed by these diverse communities for all these years, and how each of these culture tends to cry for respect, for recognition, and which as multicultural societies we need to respect and recognize each one's culture rather than emphasize on any kind of a any factor which may divide us rather than unite us for all time to come. Well, when you talk of Canada, we find 40% of the population, Canadian population presently today, tend to be of non-French in origin, or they tend to be non-British. So when you talk of non-French, non-British in origin, we can very well know that most of the immigrants tend to have come from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and many other developing countries. But here we find that not only the India and Canada and many other countries are pluralist societies, we also find over the last few hundred years that Canada has been in existence. We find over the last few hundred years, the people of French and British heritage tend to have been at the center stage of Canadian culture. While we find 40% of the population tend to be non-French, non-British, the challenge before the Canadian society and the Canadian polity was how to accommodate the cultural differences of this 40% of the total population of Canada who are non-French and non-British. I think while the French and the British people tend to have a occupied centers in history, today we can find that these have been replaced by the by the culture of 40% of the total population which are non-French and non-British in nature, and they have been replaced by non-native people within the most provinces and territories, starting from Ontario. I think when you go to Canada, when you talk of Canada, when you read about Canada, we can very well see that today when you talk about the so-called so-called sections of the society which are occupying high positions in the society, that is only because that they are not only non-French and non-British in character, they have also been able to occupy the most important positions in provinces and territories, starting from Ontario, because of their own hard work. But then the hard work would not have been possible had they not been provided with the opportunities by the already dominant people who were French and British in origin, and who were also occupying the center stage in the so-called Canadian history. Today, when you look into urban areas and centers, we find the sizable degree of diversity is also present in the in the urban areas and centers in the post World War II era. We also find that as soon as the Second World War II came to an end because of the damages, because of the devastation, because of the kind of economic calamitous effect which many developing countries were faced with following their decolonization or grant of independence by the colonial countries. This end of war tend to have resulted in the so-called process of migration, which tend to have led millions of immigrants into the so-called Western countries, and where we find that the urban areas tend to have been received from the hub of financial activities, and also tend to have attracted more newcomers over the period. So here we find, in addition to Ontario, which was multicultural nature, the end of the end of Second World War II, tend to have not only made very urban, many urban areas and centers as the hub of financial activities and cultural life. It has tend to have also attracted many more newcomers. And Toronto, as such, the later on became a city of several ethnic and racial minorities. In other words, apart from Ontario, Toronto, which is a very important city, and also the capital of Canada, tend to have also attracted many more newer number of migrants, and as such, Toronto also became to be known as a land of many ethnic minorities, many ethnic and racial minorities, where people tend to have come from. So as a result, we tend to know of Toronto, that Toronto tend to have now reported to have had over 90 different languages which are spoken there by the residents of the city. So that when 90 languages is being spoken by 90 diverse communities, we can understand that how diverse Toronto as the capital city of Canada may be in reality. And here we find when you talk of Toronto also as a result has become most culturally and also a racially diverse city. When you look into Canada in greater detail, we find that other cities and regions have also tend to demonstrate such plurality of origins and cultural traditions, which tend to represent today's multiculturalism. I think is the time. What time? What is the how much time? 1:30 to 2:30. I think 1:30 to 3. Anyway, I will just finish this, and then we go into a discussion. I think we know that while multiculturalism tends to have been practiced by many developing countries, including Canada, we now know multiculturalism anymore doesn't remain any more a foreign kind of a policy option to the so-called post-colonial societies in the post Second World War II era. So here we find multiculturalism now as such doesn't signify anymore the present reality of the Canadian population, but it probably tends to provide or define a positive public attitude towards that reality. So here we find that multiculturalism tends to be almost an answer, has arisen as an answer to the so-called as a positive public attitude towards the reality of the diversity of the so-called Canadian society. I think as such we can know very well that multiculturalism is no more anywhere remains a kind of a social ideal. It is a very much a social ideal, but it is also a value that mandates the population of any particular country to respect the growing pluralism, which is becoming more and more a fact of life in human societies, and hence the very idea of multiculturalism tend to have become very useful. And if it has become useful, what we need to do? We need to understand that multiculturalism tends to carry with it the visions of a society with inter-ethnic and interracial harmony, with due respect for cultural differences, and also tends to carry within it a long-held belief that ethnic group cohesion and individual fulfillment cannot be at all mutually exclusive, but rather it is better realized in atmosphere of mutual trust and respect for all communities and individual person to do as they please and be able to define and preserve their cultural identity. So I think when you talk about multiculturalism, we know that it has almost become a vision of the society, and it does carry a vision of a society, vision of a pluralistic society, which will not be which may be ethnically diverse, but which will not be ethnically separate. And it tends to have a vision of a society which tends to facilitate inter-ethnic and interracial harmony, which also tends to encourage due respect for cultural differences which may be existing amongst the diverse cultural communities, and it also tends to carry with it a belief that ethnic group cohesion and individual fulfillment cannot be treated anymore as mutually exclusive. Rather, it can be better realized in an atmosphere of mutual trust and mutual respect for all communities, and individuals thereby can be enabled to do as what they please and will also be able to define and preserve their cultural identity. So in the process, we find that multiculturalism tends to become a kind of a self mission, self objective, where it is individual fulfillment and the ethnic group cohesion that the ethnic community tends to look forward to can only be realized under the condition of a mutual trust, under the conditions of mutual respect for all communities. We should also be individually fulfilling, which should also be individually enabling, which should also be making individuals the agencies for individual agencies for preserving their respective cultural identities or distinctiveness with which they are blessed with. So as such, we find that the importance of multiculturalism lies in the fact that it must become the focus of a public policy, and it also must become a kind of a policy document for the individuals who are residing in any multilateral country and who are interested in maintaining the multicultural character and respect for their own culture, respect for all cultures, and also who are interested to live in a condition under the conditions of mutual trust, under the conditions of mutual well-being, which will lead to mutual prosperity. I think we will end the talk here. Since your time is going to be up, we have 10 minutes to discuss. You can, if you want to reflect on any question, any issue, you can reflect upon it, or if you're interested to ask some questions or clarification, that also we can answer. Thank you so much. Hello. Hello. Are you there? Are you all there? Hello. 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 Can you hear me? Hello. Yeah, please communicate. Yeah, okay. If you want, you can ask questions, or I can read your chat box. Please. Hello. Yeah. You can ask questions now, no problem. I think is the time up? I think, friends, if you have any questions, you can write in the chat box, or else I will. It's all right. Okay. So I hope you must have found the lecture somewhat. You must have found the lecture useful. And as you know, we will. It was nice talking to you on an issue of multiculturalism. Had there been time, we could probably go into the various aspects of our own India state policies. But I'm sure that there could be some other resource person who may be using the time. Or if I get time, we'll also come back to this work. I think with these few words, I must thank you very much. And I must tell you, if you want to communicate with me, I have already given you my website. I have given you my website where you can contact me if at all it is necessary. And then we can always be in touch. As academicians, we belong to the same class, and there is hardly any difference between you and me. And we can always look forward to more such interactions in future. I think with these few words, I take leave of you, and I wish you all the best in your career. Thank you very much.